Hi everybody, my name is Sandy Jo Leonard and I'm excited to be with you talking about evangelism. We are preparing for our upcoming ECO conference in Dallas, Texas, and it is an evangelism conference similar to what we've done at Mardi Gras for the past 29 years. But this time we have an opportunity to take it to another city, and we want to encourage you to begin praying about it if you have not already, and begin thinking about preparing for that moment, those days of evangelism and reaching others. As we think through this topic of evangelism, it's important to understand that sharing the love of Christ, sharing the saving love of Christ, is the greatest thing we can do for others. Without Christ, we are lost. Without Christ, we have no hope. Without Christ, we are stuck in our broken and fallen human condition. But with Christ, we are restored to God and have the opportunity to experience a new life here and in eternity. Sharing the saving love of Jesus Christ is the most important thing you and I can do for others. However, reaching the lost starts with caring about the lost. Think about a time before Jesus came into your life when you felt lost or hopeless or broken. And in that deep sense of lost and aloneness and perhaps hopelessness, the aftermath of experiencing Christ in your life changed that dynamic, and you may have felt restored and hope restored and renewed. I experienced a time like that before I surrendered my life to the Lord when I was 14 years old. And it was a time of feeling lost, feeling alone, being challenged by life's circumstances. And when I surrendered my life to the Lord, my life drastically changed. Suddenly, despite the circumstances, I felt a sense of hope, a sense of peace, and that Christ had restored and was working in my life. You may have been following Christ since you were a young age, and maybe you don't have that drastic before and after experience, but I want you to think about a time when you felt alone, even after you surrendered your life to the Lord, when you felt hopeless, when you felt lost, when you felt broken. What would have made the most difference at that point in your life? Somebody coming alongside and helping you to experience the love and the peace of Jesus Christ, the healing, mercy, and power of Christ in your life, and that often comes through others. It's important that we understand that reaching the lost cannot be about how many people you can win to Christ. It is not about a tally of people that you have saved through your evangelism. People are not numbers, and it's not meant to be something that you keep track of so that you can check it off and keep a running tally of those you have saved. People are not yours or mine to win. When we see evangelism efforts like this, we miss the person inside and their need for Christ. When we're looking at evangelism, we need to see the person first. We need to care about them first and care about the fact that without Christ, they are lost, both now and in eternity. I share this story a lot because it has impacted me so much. When I was pursuing a master's degree in history, we were talking about the Holocaust of Jewish people who were killed in the 1930s and 1940s under Hitler in World War II. About 6 million, approximately 6 million Jews were killed during that Holocaust. There are two big memorials or museums in the United States, one in Washington, D.C., and one in California. One of my classmates was sharing about the fact that she volunteered at the Holocaust Museum in California. And one of the things that they emphasized was that it was important to understand and know the individual person, their name, the person who lost their life, their name, their background, their age, something unique about them, their story. Otherwise, they just become a number. We cannot process this idea that 6 million Jews were killed. It just becomes a number. But when we identify with a person, somebody like Anne Frank, who wrote a diary about her experience, it draws us in to their experience. They become more than a number, they become a person. Telling people's stories helps us, and connecting with them as individuals, helps us to see past the number or the total. There are billions of people who are lost without Christ. And yet if we just look at that number, we will miss the individual inside of that number. The individual that you and I come across every day. I want to read some stories from Luke chapters 18 and 19. And I think these are two important stories that are back to back. And so we're going to examine these stories together to show how Jesus reached and ministered to the lost, particularly those who were the outcasts of society. And so in Luke 18:35, it says, as Jesus approached Jericho, a blind man was sitting by the roadside begging. When he heard the crowd going by, he asked what was happening. And they told him, Jesus of Nazareth is passing by. He called out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Those who led the way rebuked him and told him to be quiet, but he shouted all the more. You can just picture, you can feel this sense of urgency and pain and need that is coming out from this blind man. In that day and age, in that society, if you had any type of physical ailment, you were ostracized from the community. In fact, if you had a physical illness, something especially like a wound that was open, you had to, or leprosy, you had to stand off from the crowd and say unclean, meaning don't come around me because I have some type of physical ailment. Those who struggled with any type of physical issue were not taken care of in that society. And so this blind man is desperate for Jesus. And so he shouted all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. Jesus stopped and ordered the man to be brought to him. And when he came near, Jesus asked him, what do you want me to do for you? And he replied, Lord, I want to see. In verse 42, it says, Jesus said to him, receive your sight. Your faith has healed you. Immediately he received his sight and followed Jesus, praising God. And when all the people saw it, they also praised God. It's important to see that in that story, Jesus heard the man calling out to him. He heard the cry of this man who was desperate for Jesus, desperate for healing. He heard, he listened, and he stopped, and he ministered to this man. He was traveling up to Jericho. He was on his way to Jericho and then up to Jerusalem. He was on his way towards his death, towards the passion of the Christ. But somebody, a voice from the crowd, cried out to him, and he heard, he was paying attention, and he stopped, and he ministered to this man. Well, in going on from that story into the next chapter, it follows right into Luke chapter 19, verse 1, and the story of Zacchaeus. Luke chapter 19, verse 1 says that Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. He's going through Jericho, and again, he's on his journey towards Jerusalem, headed towards his death. In verse 2, it says, a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. So the story sets us up and tells us that this man was not a welcome member of society. The tax collectors, Rome at that time, who controlled Israel and the Jewish people, the Romans would use Jewish people to serve as tax collectors. And the Jewish tax collectors would collect what was required of them for the Roman taxation, but then they would collect even more beyond that. Essentially, they would be robbing people. So if the Romans asked for 50% tax, Jewish tax collectors would often ask for 70% from the people and give the 50% to the Romans and keep the 20% for themselves. So they were not well liked in the Jewish community at that time. He was a chief tax collector. He was one of the high ones, and he was wealthy. He was not going to be included in society. It also tells us that he is short. Verse 3 says, he wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. He's short. He can't see Jesus. He's not one who is welcomed in society, but he's desperate. He's desperate for Jesus. He's desperate because he's lost. He's ostracized. Now, he doesn't have a physical ailment, but he was a member of society that was not welcome. He was on the fringes. He defrauded his fellow Jewish people, his brothers and his sisters. He was not a welcome member of society, but he was desperate for Jesus. He was desperate to see and experience Jesus. Verse 3, he wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. Verse 4, so he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Jesus came to the spot, and he looked up, and he sees Zacchaeus. How often do you and I get into a rut or really focused on our own concerns and needs, many of which are legitimate, but we become so focused on our own problems or our own issues or our own challenges that we fail to look up, we fail to hear, we fail to be aware of the people around us who are desperate for Jesus. Jesus takes the time. He looks up and he says, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. Jesus knew that by doing this, he was interacting with and having fellowship with somebody who was an outcast in the community. Think about the outcasts of the community today. Who might they be? The homeless, those who are caught in some type of addiction, those with mental health disorders, those who, again, have been cast off by society or on the fringes of society because of life's challenges. Zacchaeus was one of those people, and yet Jesus fellowshipped with him. Verse 6 says, so Zacchaeus came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to the guest of a sinner. The people saw it and immediately were like, Jesus, what are you doing? You are about to go into somebody who is not a welcome member of the community. Think about your reputation, Jesus. I wonder what his disciples would have thought. Jesus, think about your reputation. You're about to fellowship with a sinner. Somebody who is seen as a Jewish person, somebody who is part of the religious Jewish people community, but who defrauded people, somebody who essentially was not following the way of God, the way of Yahweh, and yet Jesus fellowshiped with him. He didn't care about his reputation. He didn't care about what others thought of him. He saw Zacchaeus. He saw his need. He saw that he needed Jesus to come and restore him. Verse 7, all the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. Verse 8, but Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. This brief, momentary encounter with Jesus causes Zacchaeus to change his ways, to change his perspective, to be willing to give up so much of what he had not cheated the people out of, the defrauding of the people, and to give it back 4 times the amount. This brief encounter with Jesus so changed his life that he turned his life around. He responded to Jesus's ministering to his life, and he changed his focus, and he began to go in the direction that Jesus wanted him to. Verse 9, Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham." What is Jesus saying by this? He's saying this man is no longer to be ostracized. This man is no longer to be seen as a hypocrite, somebody who is harming his community. This man should be restored to the community. Jesus finishes it by saying in verse 10, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost." Jesus came to seek. He comes to the tree where Zacchaeus is, and he looks up. He sought Zacchaeus out, and he reached out to him and said, let's fellowship together. Let me interact with you, and you see the healing power that I can provide. Jesus saw Zacchaeus, and then he took the time to minister to him. It's important to notice the people in these 2 stories that Jesus sought out. Jesus reaches out to those who are physically and spiritually lost. He reaches out to the blind man who is physically lost and not allowed to be a part of the community, so desperate he is begging for money and for food. But he also reaches out to Zacchaeus, who is wealthy and yet is lost because of his actions, because of how he has treated his fellow Jew men and women. And because of that, he is outside of the community. And Jesus restores physically, spiritually, emotionally, culturally, socially. He restores the lost. Jesus sought out those types of people. He spent time with the religious leaders. He allowed himself to be questioned by them. They came along and questioned and challenged him, but Jesus sought out those who were desperate for him, those who were just waiting for him to find them, waiting for him to come alongside them, to see where they were and to save them. There are many people in our lives who are just waiting. They are desperate. They are in need of hope, of healing, of restoration. And they are just waiting for you and I to come alongside them and share the good news, the life-changing message of the gospel. We are to look for and care for those who are lost. Years ago, when I was a youth pastor, I would go into various high schools and be a part of their Bible club. I didn't necessarily teach, although sometimes I would, but I came and I just participated. I sat and I talked with students. I welcomed them into the Bible club. I was just there because I wanted to be in the public school system. I wanted to be a presence there. In one particular school, there was a student who always sat by himself. He didn't have necessarily the social, he wasn't social acumen. He looked like he might be on the fringes of society by the way he dressed, by the way he looked. He wasn't part of the in crowd. He would come in and he would sit by himself. And I made it my effort every time to talk with him and interact with him. Nobody else was talking to him, but I saw him. I noticed that he was by himself, and I made the effort to connect with him, to just build a relationship with him. That's all I did. I planted seeds. I don't know what happened to his life after that. I don't know whether or not that experience was as meaningful to him as it was to me, but I took the time to minister to him, to talk to him, to reach out to him. We are to look for and listen for those who are crying out to know Jesus. Sometimes people's voices are so soft that they are hard to hear. Sometimes people are so hidden that they are hard to see. People often go unnoticed. Those who are troubled, those who have some type of, again, mental illness or addiction, or they are on the outside of society socially, they are hard to see at times, or they are hard to interact with. And yet, they are desperate for Jesus. In looking at, unfortunately, the mass killings, particularly by teenagers in schools, teenage shootings such as the one in Columbine in 1999, Columbine, Colorado, and others have been even more. We have seen mass shootings, and especially in schools, by teenagers grow. One author, Dr. Robin M. Kowalski, says that we have found that the majority of school shooters feel marginalized. Indeed, almost half of those who perpetuate K-12 shootings report a history of rejection, with many experiencing bullying. One 16-year-old shooter, she wrote, says that he wrote that, "I feel rejected. Rejected, not so much alone, but rejected." This 16-year-old shooter, "I feel rejected. Not so much alone, but rejected. I feel this way because the day-to-day treatment I get usually is negative." It says it's usually, he experiences some positive, but the negative is like a cut. It doesn't go away really fast. This 16-year-old, the negativity that he would experience, the rejection that he experienced, cut him so deeply that it led to such an incredible tragedy. There are multiple issues, as we know, that go on inside of all of these tragedies, and yet at the heart, we know at the core, are those who are desperate for healing and restoration to Christ. Another 14-year-old shooter stated in court, "I felt like I wasn't wanted by anyone, especially my mom. I felt like I wasn't wanted by anyone, especially by members of my own family." These individuals felt rejected and insignificant. We can't control people or keep people from making huge and drastic mistakes, tragic mistakes. But what would have happened if someone had seen these two individuals in particular, the 16-year-old and this 14-year-old, what would have happened if people had noticed their sense of rejection, their sense of isolation, their sense of loneliness, and had reached out to them? What would have happened if somebody saw them hidden away in the background, or heard them as they were crying out desperately for someone to reach them? What would have changed? What would have been different? Would these situations, would these mass shootings had happened? It's important to notice that throughout this message, I'm talking about the love of Christ. It does no good to shame, guilt, or beat anyone into heaven. That is not the gospel message. This is the gospel message, that God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whosoever would believe in him would have eternal, everlasting life, as it says in John 3:16. God didn't save the world out of duty, out of anger, out of a desire to control. He saved the world because he loved us, and he continues to love us despite our weaknesses and our sinful nature. God wants to restore us and the world back to himself, to save us from a life, from an eternity without him. What would happen if you and I responded in love to people who are desperate to know Christ, who are lost in their fallen and sinful nature, who need Jesus and are desperately trying to get to him? Think about this. Who are the people in your life who go unnoticed, unseen, and unheard? What I would like for you to do, I would like for you to take some time right now to write down a list of names of people in your life. People who may seem on the fringes, or even people who may seem like they have everything together. Zacchaeus was a wealthy man. He may have even had a hardened heart, and yet he was desperate for Jesus. Who are the people in your life who need you to connect with them and reach out to them? Who are the people who maybe just whispering softly or maybe shouting? What are the things that you can do to begin to notice, purposely to seek out and to save the lost? I want you to take some time to write down those names, to think about those people, and then I want you to pray and ask God what you can do today to begin to reach those people. Thank you for sharing this time with me. I want to encourage you again to begin to move out into an expectation of boldness and courage as we head into our ECO conference and as you live your life evangelistically in your day-to-day life.